This lecture will be a continuation of part 1 about if-else and if-else-ifs. So the code I'm going to be building off of is the code that we left off on the last lecture. If you've pulled down the GitHub code, and I'll put a link in the description of this video, the finished code from the first lecture is going to be in book order, and then the stuff that we will be doing today will actually be in the book order part 2. And these will all be in the March 29th folder here. So I'm going to open up book order part 2, which is really, at the start of this, is really just going to be a copy of the first one. So if you're working along with me, pull down the code from book order and copy it over. And then when this is done, the finished code will be in this folder. Where we left off, whoops, it opened in my other window. Where we left off is we had a form that was accepting a first name and a last name, number of books, and then was giving a discount depending on how many books the customer had purchased. So if it was less than 5 books, there was no discount. That would be 0. If there was between 5 and 10, they got a 10% discount. And if there was between anything over 10, would be 15%. We were displaying the discount amount to troubleshoot and also the subtotal. Going into the button submit here, we can see that what we ended up doing is we had a series of if statements kind of glued together with this new word called else. And what else does is it will test the first if statement. If the first if statement turns out to be false, then it moves on to the else. But it's only going to go to the else if that first one is false. If this is true, this code executes, and then it goes all the way to the end, even after this last bracket, and goes on with the rest of the program execution. So what happened, for example, if the user would enter in a 4, that would be this value for a quantity. We first test, we say, is 4 less than 5? If that's true, then this will execute, and that's what happened. Then we tried it with 10, and we'd say, is 10 less than 5? No, this is false. Go on to the next one. Is 10 less than or equal to 10? Well, yes. Oops, that's not correct. We forgot. We didn't change that. That fixed that in the other code too. Overzealous with our discount rate. That should be 10. So if 10 is less than or equal to 10, then yes, the discount is now 10%. Anything else, that's why we have this else here without an if, anything else, which is essentially anything greater than 10, because we are already testing if it's less than 5, we're testing it if it's less than or equal to 10. Anything else is going to get a 15%. Let's run it just to see what we have. Starting there, the first name, hit submit. Okay, 0% discount. Subtotal is 160. I think we want to add a string format to have that in currency. And then the amount is 160, which is accurate. It's 0%. It's going to be full price. Let's try it for 6. Now we can see they're getting a 10% discount. 10% of 240 is 24. So 24 minus 240 is 216. So that's great. What I want to add to this is I want to add the total amount, and then I want to take this and I want to have a result and have it say John Smith owes $216. So it's going to be a nice string. It's going to be spelled out for the user and for the customer. I also want to add in some error handling that when the user types in gibberish here, it comes out to 0. And what I want is I want to communicate to the user that they typed in some poor input. So we're going to add those things into our existing application. So the first thing I think we'll do is we'll add that total, and we'll fix the output so that this is also in a dollar amount. So going into our form, I need, and I can just copy both of these because I like the formatting on them, drag this down, and we'll have this one, oops, that's not what I wanted, we'll have this one say total, and that one doesn't need a name because it's going to be static, and I should add my colon at the end. There we go. And then this one is going to be LBL total. Because I am already clearing out all this input on form load and on text change, I need to add a line for this variable now as well. So on form load, LBL total dot text equals string dot empty. I'm going to copy this line and scroll all the way down to my text changed event and just paste that at the end. So now that output is going to clear out along with everything else. Okay, I want to also display the value in there and then fix this for currency. So I'm going to double click on my submit button to take me to my button click code. And now down here, right in between LBL total, subtotal, and LBL message, I'll add another line, LBL total dot text equals DBL total dot toString, and then pass it a C for currency. And I can see in the line above me I wasn't doing that for subtotal, so I'm going to add one there as well. Let's run it and make sure we got our program looking good. Okay, 160, 160, type, it clears out accurately. Go in for 10 and hit enter, and now I get everything that I want. So let's talk about how we're going to do this. And what we have is we have a string for first name, we have a string for last name. We've already pulled those out of the text boxes. So in our first part where we declared variables and then got input, we have string first name, pulling it out of the txt first name text box. Same thing with last name here. So we have two strings. We also have a string that is a result of our total calculation. Let's take a look at that. We also have a string here. We're putting it inside of a text box, but dbltotal.toString is a string. So we have three strings. And what I want to do is I want to take all of this, first name, last name, and total, and I want to put it together in a nice sentence. And I want to say, John Smith owes $360. And so what we have to do is basically take all those three parts and kind of squish them together into one big string. What we've done before in the past is we've kind of taken two labels and snuck some magic in between so it looked like it. But we can actually take our strings and we can add them together, just like we would add two integers together. And so we already have kind of a container for it. And now what I want to do is, instead of taking the total there, I'm going to split this out in a separate line because this is all part of output, and that's why I'm doing that in here. I'm going to say str message equals, and then, well, what do we want to do? Well, remember we wanted to take our first name, so I'm going to take str first name, and then this is all we need to do, plus, just like you'd add two integers, if you add two strings, it's going to glue them together. And so we say string last name. And that's going to take them and it's going to put them into one longer string. And then we want to say, and we can do this in line, we don't have to declare this in another variable. What we're doing is we're adding together strings. So I say quote owes, because that's a string, we can do that in line. And then lastly, well, how did I get my total before? I did this line right here. So I said dbl total dot toString, and then I passed it a C. Whoops. And so this is going to take all of my input, all my output, and it's going to dump it into this message right here. And then to get it to display, well, before we were displaying total, so now we want it to display string message. And so now we should have a nice message when we hit submit. So here we go. I got first name, last name, quantity, and now we have John Smith owes 160. Now, one thing you're going to notice is that there aren't any spaces. But look at our code. We didn't tell it to put any spaces. It's not smart enough to figure out on its own that you have to put spaces in there because it doesn't know what a first and last name is. It doesn't know what owes means. So we have to actually add some spaces in. Easiest one that we can do is if we put a space in front of owes and one at the end. That's part of it. We got that part done, but now what we want to do is we want to add a space in between John and Smith as well. And so we have to be kind of tricky. If we've been adding them together here, we want to kind of split it out and sneak something in between. So I'm going to say plus, and then all I have to do is quote, space, quote, because that's a space. That is a string. We've done this before, right? An empty string? Well, you can put a space in there as well. You can put as many spaces as you want, in fact, but we're going to put one in. So now, I'm going to hit F5, and now I have John Smith owes $160. And so we just built a string. And now, when you add strings together like this, it has a fancy name. It's called concatenation. So you often hear say, well, we're going to concatenate those strings. That means that you're going to take two strings or more, and you're going to add them together like this. You're going to glue them together. What I think I want to do is, I think I can make this look a little nicer. I'm going to drag my form down, drag this down as well, and have this kind of be off on its own. And maybe give it a little bit of a different font size to draw it out. Maybe I'll make it bold too. Maybe we can go 16 or something like that. And so now, John Smith owes $160. And depending on how long their name is, it can stretch it out over here as well. So now we have a nice formatted result that is using our input and also using the results of our calculation on top of that. What's next? Well, we talked about possibly communicating something to the user about if they type in bad input. We want to communicate to them to say, hey, you typed in non-numeric data inside of your quantity. And so what we need for that is we want to have a label, first and foremost, because we want to have something to display. But also, we need to talk about how we're going to actually do it. And that is, we've been using try-parse this whole time to test out our data. And if we look, here's our line right here. And we've always kind of had to assume that this was the way to use it. This is how we were supposed to use it. We give it a text box, text, or just a string, and then we have to use this out. We have to use that out because that's going to be what contains the value of whatever our input is. But I kind of had asked in a previous lecture to say, you just have to trust me on this. It'll become clear on why we had to do that. That is because this try-parse actually has another use. And if you recall from our if statements here, when we're doing our conditional logic, when we're using our comparison operators here, our less than or equal sign, this statement evaluates to true and false, or false rather. This statement will evaluate to true or false. Whenever we're using an if statement, we have to have something in these statements that evaluates to true or false, to a Boolean statement, a Boolean value. Well, this try-parse actually evaluates to true or false. We say that this try-parse function returns a true or false value. So we can actually catch that value and put it in a variable inside of a Boolean variable. We can say bool, let's call it BLN, that's our Boolean prefix for our naming conventions, just like INT is for int. And I'm going to call it BLN success. And what this will do is that if this is successful, not only does it take that number and place it inside of this variable, but it will also return a true or false value. So we can take this variable and we can test it to see if in fact they entered in valid input. If it's bad input, if they entered in ABC instead of 4, for example, then this would be false. So we can use this inside of an if statement. Let's do just that. And we can say if BLN success, that's our Boolean, a Boolean is going to be true or false, equals true, then execute this code. But we don't want it if it's true. If it's true, everything's fine. We don't want to congratulate the user and say, hey, way to enter in a numeric value. It's kind of expected. What we want to test it for is when it is false. So if this value is false, right, if Boolean equals false, that's what we want, then we're going to output some sort of error message to the user. To do that, we have to create a label on our form. I'm going to borrow one of these again. I'm going to right-click copy, right-click paste. I want to make this nice and visually popping out. So inside of my label properties, there's a property called forecolor. I'm going to change this, go over to the web line tab. I'm going to pick red. I want a bright red error message. In my text, I'm going to put my placeholder stuff, LBL error, and then I'm going to call this LBL error as well. And now I'll have a nice error message on what's going on. Just like all the rest of these, I want to clear out that output on form load, and I want to clear it out on text change. So let's do that as well. LBL error dot text equals string dot empty. Scrolling down to my text changed, LBL error dot text equals string dot empty. Now that I have that label error in place, inside of my button click where I'm testing for that output, I can now say LBL error.text equals please enter a number for number of books. And now let's run it and let's see what happens. So here we got 4, hit submit, everything is great. Hit 5 ABC, hit submit, and now we have please enter a number for number of books. And now we don't get the error message and everything is great. So we have a pretty good program right now. So what can we do to make it better? Well, one thing is, if you notice right here, we're still getting zeros, and I think that's okay, but we could possibly use an if statement to make sure that these things all remain blank instead, and we could wrap everything inside of a big if statement right here, just like we're testing to see if this Boolean is false or not. But we're not going to do that, but it certainly is possible. Another thing that is a possibility is, let's say that someone entered in their name like this, and they wanted to do all capital letters for whatever reason. And so now in our output, it looks kind of weird because this part's all capital and this part is all lowercase. So there are things that we can do with our strings to further change how their appearance is, and we would say we can manipulate them. We've already learned that we can take strings and we can add them together, that we can concatenate them, but we also can alter what those contents are, and we would say that there are certain string manipulation functions. And there are genuine legitimate uses for it. Here we're kind of playing around with them just to show what those things are that we can use them for. Well, let's see what that looks like. So if I wanted to say, for example, fix those cap locks and take everything down to lowercase, I would type this. I would say string first name equals, and then I would use the same string on the right hand side of my equal sign. So I'm going to take that, and then there's a method that you call on the string called dot to lower. It's an action, it's a method, it's a function, so we have to put the parentheses at the end. Otherwise it thinks we want a variable. So look at this, will evaluate out to a string that is the same string but all lowercase. And we're taking that and then it's returning it into the original variable. Let's do the same thing with last name. str last name equals str last name dot to lower. So we're taking both of these variables and changing them to lowercase. So now even if they type in John, it's going to take all of it to lowercase. And you'll notice that even if I did some capitals, some lowercase, it still takes it all to lowercase. Maybe we want all uppercase instead. So instead of calling to lower, I can call to upper. And that will give me the uppercase version of that string. What if we have a user that's trying to break our program and trying to be a wise guy here? Maybe someone's going to say, put a bunch of spaces in front of their name and after their name. Well, we're reading the whole thing out of the text box. So if we do that, it's actually going to make our output look really goofy with all those extra spaces in there. So, and they could even go so far as this, right? And put a whole bunch after, just keep going, and eventually it's going to push that rest of that output off of our screen. And so we can actually account for that. So on another line, we can say str first name equals str first name dot, and there is a helper method called trim. And what trim will do is it will take all of the spaces off the front of our string and off the end. We would say we are removing the trailing and leading spaces from first name. And we can do the same thing with last name. And this way, we are only getting whatever data it is that they actually typed. And who knows, maybe they fell asleep on the space bar or something like that. We don't know. But this way, it'll remove all of these extra spaces in here, and it still looks like how we would expect. If you want to allow maybe spaces at the end and not at the beginning, let me comment these lines out here. Oops. We can remove only the front if we want to. Or we would say leading spaces. And we would say str first name equals str first name dot trim start. And that would remove all of the spaces from the beginning. And remember, these are string manipulations. We're taking the value of this string and we're manipulating it, oops, to do something a little different. str last name equals str last name dot trim start. So if I put a bunch of spaces in front, but then maybe a bunch of spaces after this one, you'll see that they're together, but there's still that space right here. And then, because there's a trim start, well, you know there's got to be... Oh, now my IntelliSense is breaking. There we go. Trim end. And that will remove everything from the very end. So you could do these all separately if you wanted to, put them all together. Update my comment. But usually what you're going to do is you want to strip out the spaces that are in the beginning and at the end of it. Now, although we're capitalizing the first name and the last name, maybe this part bugs you too. And so what we could have done is I could comment out these lines, or I could leave them, it really doesn't matter, and you can do the entire message. It doesn't matter how short the string is, it doesn't matter how long the string is. And now my entire message is going to be all capital letters. It seems rather aggressive to the customer, but maybe that's what our client wants. And so this is really just a start of string manipulation. It's difficult to work it in because kind of where we are right now, there's not a lot of practical applications for it. Sometimes it's really just doing a display, for example. But you'll find that in modern programming, especially with web development, like in ASP.NET, a lot of the data that you're getting, and next time you're in front of an application, take a look and see if you can figure out what's going on with some of the strings. But a lot of the data we get as users of modern applications comes out in string format. If you look at what's behind a web page, that's all strings. And for the most part, I would say most websites are created dynamically. So somewhere along the line there's some code that's building out that giant string that is giving you what looks like a web page. That's how web pages are able to be updated. If you go to a news website, that news website is going to be up to date. There's not someone behind the scenes editing the HTML manually. It's being generated by code. It's pulling it out from a database. So just as a quick review of our application, we have something that is pulling out first and last name. It's putting it in a nice formatted message for us. We're able to capitalize all of it and trim out the spaces. We have, based on our input of quantity of books, we have different levels of discounts, different results. It's all clearing on a text changed. And we have it so that now finally we can use try-parse to tell us and the user that maybe they've typed the input in wrong and they want to have numeric data instead. So it's actually a very complex application. It's doing quite a bit behind the scenes. And I think, we really could go out and write applications like this to help people with things like figuring out what their totals are. Maybe they can't have a cash register and they just want to be able to figure out what their total is. All their books are $40, and this would give them a nice way of getting that input out. Nice simple application on the front, but behind the scenes we know that quite a bit of work went into it. We have our if statement with else ifs and an else. We're doing our calculation, we're outputting all the results. It's a pretty good application. And we are learning that now with if statements and else statements we can actually have a pretty decent program flow depending on user input.